Thank you so much for coming. My name is Dinesh Chandrasekhar. I'm with Hortonworks. This session is about global data management. We'll be talking about a practical framework, why global data management is important and how it addresses some of the challenges with data and data management. Joining me today is also Matt Aslett from 451 Research, and he would be presenting along with me. So we have it kind of like divvied up. I'll speak for the first part, and then Matt will pick it up and talk more from a data standpoint, like particularly addressing some of the data points, industry trends that he's seeing, and how that maps into some of the concepts around global data management. So without further ado, let's jump into it. I want to address what we mean by global data management. So for that, to set some context, let's talk about what is data looking like in today's enterprises. I mean, if you look at verticals across the board, we see development, manufacturing, distribution, all these different verticals. Everybody's talking about some form of connected this, connected that. It's like either connected trucks or farm to fork kind of a model that also focuses on some kind of connected ecosystems, connected supply chains. So you see this pattern emerge where everything is driven by data these days, and all enterprises are data-driven enterprises. And the whole notion of data-driven primarily means that there are several industry trends that are influencing it, and data becomes like a very key aspect in this whole notion. And IoT is something that you will see emerge as a common trend across the board as well, which leads to the notion of connectedness, right? So we are living beyond the notion of just connected devices today, and we are talking about connected communities, connected ecosystems, and whatnot. And this is partly because also because of the consumer trends that we are seeing. I mean, there's stronger consumer demand that is also happening that is leading to this connectedness, right? So if you look at, let's say, Amazon, you cannot imagine a search or any kind of a shopping experience today on any other website where you don't look for 5-star ratings or, this is what other customers bought, here's what we recommend, that kind of experience, right? You expect that innately when you go to any kind of website. And same thing with other types of applications that we use, like Uber, for instance, where you say, I want to get a cab. You no longer sweat it. You just pull out your mobile phone and you're able to call it. That kind of connectedness again. And VR and AR are pretty much there, right? So we are in the age where everything is talking about 3D printing and VR and everything else. So in that kind of context, then suddenly enterprises are challenged. If consumers are expecting this, enterprises need to deliver that as well, right? So what that also translates to is enterprises trying to challenge themselves into more and more advanced use cases. For example, I talked with one of the shipping companies, actually an insurance company that is focused on tracking their shipments because they are dealing with jewelry. And they are insuring jewelry, and they want to track where that piece of jewelry is, anywhere from their store to a show where the jewelry is being shipped to. And they want to understand at any given point in time where that jewelry is. And for that, they're trying to think of embedding that with nano devices. Shippers like FedEx and UPS, they're also thinking about these kinds of little devices that they can put in with shipments that they can be disposed of, but at the same time gives them real-time visibility into where that particular shipment is. And then talk about mobile notifications when it comes to supply chains. Apple has been doing this forever, where they can understand any given point in time whether a particular shipment is going to be delayed or not, right? So that is something that they can do, that they could do several years ago. And this is something that has advanced to a much more advanced degree today. Chatbots, virtual assistants, you name it. I mean, these are all, again, extreme examples of where enterprises are taking it to offer greater customer experiences, but again, providing that notion of connectedness where customers don't feel alienated. They are part of the ecosystem, they're part of the enterprise, and they want to be treated that way. And so when you say that, what is stopping you from digital transformation, right? This kind of advanced use cases. As an enterprise, what is it that is stopping you? And that's the question that we are here to answer today, because that will lead us to the challenges question, and that can then lead us to the point of solution where global data management can address that, right? So one of the key questions is 360-degree view of a customer. This is something that everybody's talking about, right? And particularly in the notion of big data, we're all struggling with that. Everybody wants to do that. But the challenge has been The customer data no longer exists in one single data store anymore. I mean, gone are the days when you could like go into a CRM system and say, all my customer data is in there. It's no longer the case because customer data exists there. It's existing in multiple data lakes. It exists on cloud, on-premises, as well as in social circles, because you want to understand what your customer is talking about, your products, your company, within social streams as well. So you want to capture sentiment analysis and publish that into your 360-degree view as well. So as a support person, if I'm out there, I want to understand what my customer is talking about me or my products out there, right? So that's, again, part of the 360-degree view. Too many data lakes is also a thing because we are talking about the age of M&A activity going on. So it's not just like one data lake. There are several data lakes that enterprises deal with, which kind of defeats the whole notion of data lakes because that's supposed to be like the single central source. But suddenly you have like multiple data lakes that also adds up to a challenge of not being able to like address transformations, digital transformations. And the more important critical challenge is you typically have like data coming in from multiple sources and in multiple formats. IoT is by far like the biggest example that I can provide you, where there's no single standard. Every device out there has its own set of protocols, every data format that you can think of, and there are like zillion vendors out there, and the IoT ecosystem map is like mind-boggling, right? So that's one example. But as an enterprise today, you are dealing with partner ecosystems that are like on the cloud, on-premises, and like far and beyond. So again, you're talking about multiple data sources, streaming, non-streaming, batch, you name it. I mean, you have like the whole gamut of capabilities that you're dealing with. And so that also adds to the challenge of how do I deal with all this data? How do I ingest that? And then how do I put that to some kind of common sense? One of the key questions that needs to be addressed as a part of global data management is, do you have the right data at the right time to make the right decisions? Because that's going to be fundamental in order to like execute your digital transformations. If, for example, I like to talk about this as data decay. Data has a time life, like a lifespan within which it becomes valuable and after which it kind of starts decaying, right? There is data at rest, which is always helpful for historical insights. You look at it and you go like, yeah, this is all like good stuff that we've gathered over the years. I need to be able to like pull data out and gain some historical insights, maybe even build like machine learning models for like future pattern recognition and all that. But then when you talk about real-time data like IoT or something like that, there is a very narrow opportunity window within which you have to make sense of that data. And if you don't do that, then you're missed that and you've lost that opportunity to either gain a particular customer, go into a new channel, or maybe like make like operational efficiencies in terms of like machine fine-tuning or whatever be your point of focus. A quick example would be like a trucking company that is like shipping refrigerated foods, perishable goods. If for a specific time window you are not able to understand that the temperature for that particular perishable good is like gone up and you need to fix that, if you don't do that, then obviously the driver is going to recognize that fact only like 2 days later after he has reached the destination, then that becomes a challenge, right? I mean, you lost that goods because the temperature has gone up and you've not fixed that in the given time window. Contrast that with like real-time alert going to the driver saying something is going on with your truck, you need to fix that right away. That would be that time window that I'm talking about. That's where data decay becomes relevant. So having the right data at the right time to make the right decision, very important. So what we are dealing with today then is enterprises that have this kind of a modern data architecture. This is something that I like to talk about as something that you don't design, but something that grows around you. It's something that you inherit because of industry trends, because of challenges around you, because of consumer demands, because of all these other competitive pressures that you have to live up to where you need to be to meet consumer demands. So you have IoT, you have social streams, you have edge-based devices, you have edge analytics, and you have all different needs to like combine that with historical data, and then throw in multiple data centers, multi-cloud. You have the whole gamut of complexities right there. And this is what enterprises are dealing with today. I mean, you might say, I don't deal with all that. I just have like one data lake and that's it. You are totally wrong, right? I mean, you talk to your IT folks, you talk to your LOB folks, they're going to say, oh, well, we have these set of systems in here, and we need these applications to be synced up. And then my customer data, again, is like all over the place, right? So then you put that all together, this is what you're looking at. So which is where we start talking about global data management. How does that address and enable a modern data architecture like this? So if you look at that, we are going to need a system that focuses or looks at data across multiple data sources, across multiple data centers, across clouds, as well as on-premise systems, right? So if you look at that, then what you need is something that can address these data management challenges. Because so far we have talked about data challenges that exist in our enterprise. If you look at data management challenges, then you're dealing with multiple clouds. And it's not something very uncommon, because I was sitting at a customer advisory board session yesterday. We had like 30, 40 customers in the room. And one of the questions that we posed as a survey was, how many of you here are having multiple clouds, like Amazon and Azure and this and that? How many of you guys have that? And then suddenly like a whole bunch of hands went up. It was very surprising to see that, but shouldn't be surprising, because that's the nature of the environments that we live in today. So we do have enterprises that have, for the nature of the systems that they deal with, multiple clouds. And then you, as an enterprise or an architect that is like designing for systems, need to make sure that you don't get into some kind of a vendor lock-in, right? That's a big deal. You don't want to like settle in for a system that ties you into a particular vendor and says, this is it, you're stuck for the next 4 years, 5 years. You don't want that. You want something that is future-proof, that is making your architecture grow with you, you can adapt to it. And that's what you want. And then, most importantly, you want to be able to manage data regardless of where it is, where it exists, and what type of data it is. That is going to be critical for a global data management solution. So if you need to look at that, you need to look at data more holistically within an enterprise. Take data at rest, which you always have, right? Data lakes, however you want to look at, that's all data at rest. And then there is data in motion, which is all the streaming data that we talked about, right? IoT and mobile streams and click streams and whatnot. All that is also very relevant to your enterprise. So you combine that together, then you have a need for a global data management solution, or a compelling solution that kind of looks at data holistically and says, I can look at data and manage data and secure data, more importantly, govern data. We are in the age of GDPR. I mean, I cannot stress the need for data provenance and governance in today's world, right? So that is also going to be part of your global data management needs. So that is what can help you with addressing this holistically. And that can lead you to like addressing more modern data use cases, right? Whether it be cybersecurity, whether it is like, EDW optimization kind of a use case, or just like, more advanced analytics and data science. So that's pretty much what global data management looks like. That's like a broad stroke of what a definition for global data management is. What I would like to do is kind of jump into, once I explain what this journey looks like for an enterprise is, kind of jump into Matt's section, where he'll address some of the industry trends and all that, right? If you look at an enterprise today, what their digital transformation journey looks like, it starts in like 3 steps. One is data, looking at data, organizing your data and all that. 2 is the governance angle, pretty much focusing on how it should be governed. And governance is like a much broader topic. I have a separate session for it tomorrow, so you should come to that. And then 3rd is about like gaining intelligence from it. As I talked about data decay and all that, it is all about figuring out what the data means to you. Harnessing the value of the data right then and there is what we need to figure out. So that's pretty much what a digital transformation journey looks like for any enterprise today. I'm oversimplifying it, but at the broad stroke, this is what a 3-step process looks like, right? So I would like to invite Matt now to talk about some of the broader industry trends that he's seeing, more specifically data points that kind of prove some of the things that I talked about. I think that'll be very good for you. So please welcome Matt Taslet.
Thanks. Thanks, Dinesh, and yeah, thank you for having us in this session. So I'm Matt Taslet. I'm Research Director for Data Platforms and Analytics at 451 Research. So we are an independent IT research and advisory firm, and so as I say, obviously, while we're both talking about the same subject here, you can almost think of this as you get a 2 for 1, 2 presentations on the same theme, and we made sure we weren't stepping on each other's toes, but independent content. So, but I'm sort of picking up actually on where Dinesh finished there in terms of organizations, what they're trying to do and how they're trying to get to value of data quicker. Certainly, the challenges that organizations face are not the fact that they don't have data. There's more than enough data. There's more than enough data sources. More than enough data formats. There's more than enough locations where all that data is. But in order to generate the value from that data, you need to identify what data you have and where it is, and obviously, the nature of that data. This is particularly relevant given, obviously, the increased use of cloud and or hosted services for storing data. And it was interesting in the keynote this morning, I think 25% of the people in the audience said they weren't going to move any data to the cloud. So it was fascinating because maybe they're not, but almost guarantee that somebody within their organization is. And if it's not the cloud, it would be some other hosted service. So, software as a service, infrastructure as a service, on-premise private cloud, et cetera, et cetera. Data is spread increasingly across different environments. And we see this also in terms of the adoption of cloud data processing services. So actually, in our research over the previous years, we've seen that data processing workloads were somewhat behind in terms of moving to being adopted on the cloud. But actually now we see here, if you can look at the top 2 and actually 6 of the top 12 public cloud, we use the term features here, but basically services that we see organizations are using are data or analytics or data warehousing, streaming, machine learning. So increasingly, data is in the cloud, data processing workloads are in the cloud. Why is that? Probably, we all know this, but just to reiterate from the data we're seeing, reducing IT cost is obviously a significant reason for that. Enhancing, the agility is also a significant factor, as well as, newer technologies driving the adoption of both cloud and obviously on-premises modernization. Now, one important thing to note here, as I stumbled over my words a little bit, because I started to say about workloads moving to the cloud. It's something I always try and correct myself on, because of course we know that not all workloads that are in the cloud are being moved there. And I think we have a habit as an industry of talking about workloads moving to the cloud when in fact, most of them are not being lifted and shifted from on-premises to the cloud. And this is some really interesting data that we had on this. That talks about the different ways in which organizations are taking advantage of cloud. And you see, the classic lift and shift, if you like, take an existing workload, move it to the cloud. Just 12% of respondents, according to this survey. We see, it's a bit nuanced in terms of how organizations are doing that. Slightly more are doing what we would call repurchase and shift. So, perhaps the same workload, but on a newer version of the existing technology. And then refactoring and shift. So, ultimately the workload is, yes, moving from on-premises to cloud, but it's not just a matter of lifting it up and moving it over. And interestingly, of course, here, 44%, not the majority, but the biggest proportion of organizations actually keeping that workload on premises, but doing so on a modernized architecture. So, this is the sort of thing we need to keep in mind when we think about how organizations are using the cloud. And these are some of the reasons why, we believe that, the future of the cloud is definitely multi-cloud and it's hybrid cloud. And there's some interesting ways in which we can think about that. So this is something we did. This is looking specifically at database revenue, so operational and analytic database revenue, not necessarily big data and Hadoop, but this kind of we did this specifically in response to a particular client request, and it's looking at extrapolating database revenue. So we see today 70+% of database revenue is on-premises, non-cloud environments. But we look at how the trends that we're seeing from the interviews that we do with end users, and we apply that to our models in terms of projecting revenue. We see that by 2021. On-premises non-cloud, on-premises private cloud, infrastructure public as a service public cloud, and software as a service platforms as a service will each account for roughly 20 to 25% of revenue on these projections. And this is significant because from an end user perspective, that means that you need to prepare for a future in which your database revenues at the very least are going to be spread across multiple environments. And it's significant, of course, as well. We think about this from a vendor perspective and which vendors are going to be successful. It's those that can actually supply their customers with technologies that can run in those multiple environments and provide them with a consistent experience across those multiple environments. So we think about what enterprises are looking for when they're looking at suppliers. It's very much sort of this bridge to the cloud. They've got their on-premises workloads. They're looking at multiple strategies to take, so doing it again, either move or perhaps shift those workloads across to the cloud or refresh in the cloud environment. And they're looking for vendors that can help them do that by providing a consistent experience across that journey. Now, if we look at the different clouds that are in use, this is some data that we get in terms of looking at which are the most widely used cloud providers. Now, I think what jumped out at me, and I'm sure many of you on this, is the fact that we've got Azure so close to AWS. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we're talking about usage in general here. We're not saying, which is your strategic cloud provider. And of course, we need to take into account the fact that, Azure Access actually becomes licensed, bundled with a Microsoft EA license. So we see a lot of organizations out there that are using Azure perhaps a bit sporadically, but it means if you look at overall usage, it bumps up the numbers a bit. And the other important thing is within these numbers, we see that close to 60% of public cloud users are using more than one cloud provider. And so again, this is another reason why these numbers are bumped up, and you can see some of the detail in that. And so we see that it is a multi-cloud world already, and it's going to continue to be, and increasingly will be, a multi-cloud world. The important thing here is that it's becoming a multi-cloud world deliberately. So it's one thing for organizations to accidentally stumble into using multiple clouds. I mean, so most organizations have kind of done that. Different projects have used different environments for different use cases. And so they've got multiple cloud providers, but it's quite different to actually use multiple clouds for deliberately to run a specific workload. And this is something we actually added this option in, I think it was about a year and a half ago to our questionnaires. And so this is our specific, people talk about multi-cloud or hybrid cloud. When we talk about hybrid cloud, we're talking about people specifically using multiple clouds to run a single sort of business functional workload. And what we see is that organizations are increasingly looking to do that. So actually we ask companies, is this something you're looking to do in relation to a specific workload? As you can see, nearly half of them said yes, they're planning to, they're already doing that. Only 29% are not at all, and the rest are actually planning to or considering doing that. So why would you do that? I mean, in some ways, it doesn't really make sense. There are some potential benefits, but obviously there's complexities involved. And what we see is that, improving the performance and availability is the top reason. Optimizing for cost, which is easier said than done, and we've got a whole unit of analysts and researchers who focus specifically on sort of the costs of cloud. Is another. And then you see some of the other reasons. Sort of migration is obviously one of the reasons, or regulatory and data sovereignty requirements another, and isolating sensitive business data. So with that kind of, some of the trends that we see as a context for what we see going on, and in relation to what obviously Dinesh talked about, we now get to this point where our research has been talking a lot recently about this issue of global data management and how organizations can deal with the challenges that is presented by the fact that they're using multiple clouds or hybrid clouds, and of course continue to use on-premises. And we see, we can put this in the context of historically, data management should be really easy. Because obviously, if you follow the logic that you have a single data warehouse to run all your business, then that would be where all your data is, and everything's fine, because that's at the heart of the enterprise, and you don't have to worry about data management because it's all in one place. Of course, that's not what happens at all. And of course, data is distributed throughout your organization in terms of different data marts, departmental data warehouses, now, these days, data lakes. And as if that wasn't bad enough, you add in the cloud. And again, in theory, the cloud would be another layer around the enterprise infrastructure, but actually what it ends up being is multiple clouds with multiple database services and multiple environments, some of which are completely incompatible with each other. And then you add in the edge as well, and you've got now more data spread out, throughout to the edge and multiple networks. And obviously, this is clearly, a simplification. You could add in multiple circles to actually represent that. So how do organizations, go about alleviating some of the challenges that go along with this? Well, one of those potential approaches would be to obviously standardize across those different clouds and different environments. Standardize on as few data processing platforms as you can. And this is something clearly we see that organizations are working towards in many cases. It doesn't necessarily make sense to turn the whole thing green. There are still reasons why you want to use a particular database or data processing engine for a particular workload. Again, obviously, not all databases, data processing engines are available in all cloud environments, et cetera. So, to the extent that they can, we see a lot of organizations are trying to do this. Another of the key technologies we see is relevant here is the data catalog, and the data catalog providing an environment through which organizations can index and enable self-service discovery of data. Initially, in many of the deployments, we've seen that's done in a single data lake environment. We've actually got a survey running this week that we'll be doing a webinar on next week. Yeah, next Wednesday, talking about this very thing, in that initially a lot of the projects are driven by a single data lake, but increasingly, just only looking 2 years down the line, most organizations are actually looking to do this across their entire data estate. So we see, it's still early stages in terms of sort of data catalog-based governance and indexing, but the plans of those that have already adopted are to aggressively roll this out throughout the organization. And this is obviously highly relevant, as Dennis suggested, to take a little segue into sort of, the importance of regulations and things like GDPR. And I pinched this idea from Chris Hellenbach from SAP, this idea of sort of Schrodinger's data and the role that the catalog potentially has to play in alleviating some of the challenges here. Because if you don't, we've already talked about the challenge if you don't know what data you have across multiple environments. Well, if you don't know whether that data is publicly identifiable, and you don't know whether that data should be forgotten, then how can you address that without going and actually looking at it? And once you've looked at it, then you've got a problem because you've looked at data that you shouldn't have looked at. So, the catalog doesn't alleviate this completely, but at least, with increasingly we see machine learning and automation of identification of data, which can at least tell you, yeah, this probably contains personally identifiable information, and you can, approach it probably somewhat differently than you would if it definitely didn't. So, this is increasingly complex, but within this, illustration that we think, there actually lies the solution or a route to the solution to this problem, which is the data fabric. Now, this is a term which we've also done a lot of looking into and thinking about over recent years, because it's a term that's been used by different organizations in different parts of the industry for different reasons. So it's a little bit difficult. If you start talking to people, particularly some vendors, about data fabric, you need to make sure you're clear about what they and you are talking about and make sure they're the same thing. For example, storage vendors have been using the term data grid, data caching vendors use the term. Obviously, increasingly, we see this at a sort of a Hadoop data lake kind of level of the extension of that. So what do we mean when we think about a data fabric? So think about the fabric. What is a fabric? It's a structure of something, the manner in which the parts of the thing are united. So you think about that, a material made of cloth. It's the way in which the textiles and the fibers are interweaved. But also, sort of more intangibly, a fabric is sort of the framework that underlies a structure. So you think about this in terms of sort of the fabric of space and time, or the fabric of society. What turns a group of people into a community? It's kind of intangible, but it's the thing that it's not the individuals, it's the thing that binds them together. And so if we think about this from a data fabric perspective, the data fabric is not the individual data processing engines and data platforms. It's kind of the interconnective tissue that binds all those together. So we think about what does that mean in practical terms? It probably means a consistent user experience across all those multiple platforms and environments, whether that's on-premises or the cloud. It's the ability to identify data in those multiple environments, both on-premises and on the cloud, which, as I said, is increasingly being done automatically through machine learning and recommendations etc. The ability to manage data in those individual environments, both on premises and in the cloud, and to do things like data lifecycle management, data governance, data security, and then ultimately the ability to manage data across that entire environment as if it was a single environment. Now, this is the point at which we enter into this as a work in progress. And, all of the vendors in this space, I think, we see have this same vision of enabling an organization to manage data across their entire data estate as if it was a single environment. But, these are complex issues, and it's, as I say, it's work in progress. But we do think that some of the fundamental building blocks are there. Standardization clearly, is a key issue here. The data catalog to identify data and enable you to discover data across those environments is a key building block. And that concept of the fabric itself is a key building block, and the services that are enabled by that data fabric. So, as I say, this is something we're looking at, and we're sort of researching into and looking at all the vendors in this space and their various strategies. It is a work in progress, but I think the good thing is there's hope, and there are combinations of technologies that are being delivered that will enable at least some of these issues to be overcome. Of course, all the time, the amount of data keeps growing and the problem keeps getting bigger as well. So, it's a work in progress, as I say, but, it's an interesting space. It's something that we're going to continue to be watching over the next couple of years. I think it's the most interesting challenge, actually, arguably, from a data management perspective there's been for many, many years. So with that, Dinesh, you want to just finish up?
Why don't you click on the next one? Yeah. So what I want to wrap it up with is, pretty much talk about the strategy, right? I mean, Matt touched on like some of the fantastic, data points here about what the industry is actually alluding to when they talk about multi-clouds, or what different types of data sources exist, what different types of data formats exist, what are some of the challenges that we have as an enterprise. So with that said, your question might be like, what is my strategy going to be then, right? So as a data strategy, what I recommend is, look at it as a connected data strategy. We are looking at the age of connected data platforms. So look at data at rest as well as data in motion together, in a holistic way, in a combined way. That will give you the flexibility to look at a 360-degree view of the customer or something like that, more across the enterprise, across all the relevant data sources in a way. And the way to do that is to leveraging global data management with all the capabilities that Matt touched on, like a data catalog or metadata management and all that, right? So those are all the key essential capabilities that you look for in a global data management. And those capabilities will help you enable, tie those two things together, including some of the things that are about sensitive data. How do I catalog, or how do I metadata tag some of the sensitive data items and make sure that I'm not including them in the data sets to users that are not supposed to be seeing them and all that. So that's where GDM comes, full fruition of being able to tie all the different data sources that you deal with across the enterprise, inside and outside the edge, but also be able to provide you with management and security and governance capabilities. So with that said, we'll throw it open for questions. Matt is here, I'm here, so what did you think? Did this make sense? If you have any questions, there are mics, please feel free to ask. Yes, please. Does that mic work? The one stand. Do you want to use that mic? Sorry.
I think that explained the problem pretty well. But what kind of tools would you recommend to actually implement something like that?
So I didn't want it to make it a vendor pitch, which is why I didn't talk about any products.
What about keeping it open source, like in Atlas or something?
Yeah, so Atlas is definitely one, right? So if you talk about Apache Atlas, that's what customers are using across the board in terms of data governance and all that. And then you combine that with, let's say, Ranger, Knox, and all that. Then you bring in the security angle where you can talk about combined governance and security for data across the board. So that would be kind of like your open source answer to that.
Yeah, I think as I said, this is a work in progress. There are multiple vendors that are, and there isn't going to be one single solution to this. But yeah, I just said, Atlas, Ranger, governance, some of the core components. I think, if you look at the ecosystem, certainly there's a role here for companies like Elation and Waterline, which clearly partner to some extent with Hortonworks, in terms of sort of initially focused on the data lake, but looking out to the cloud. Clearly, the cloud providers have a role to play here in terms of working with some of those open source technologies as well. And then the storage vendors as well. So I said some of the storage vendors are using the term data fabric, but they're thinking about very much the underlying physical storage and enabling the movement of data. And, clearly, actually one of my colleagues in our storage practice wrote a really interesting report earlier this year about, the importance of metadata in that space. And it ties completely into this in terms of using metadata to identify what data you've got, what it's used for, but also, how it's stored, physically stored. And that's when data lifecycle management and all that stuff comes in. So, there is still going to be multiple pieces, but, there at least is some coalescence in the industry, I think, around this concept. So, yeah, we're getting there.
Yeah, please.
Regarding the data fabric and your interconnectivity tissue,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on data virtualization technology to provide that interconnectivity tissue?
Yeah, so one, if everyone can hear that, was the question of the potential role of data virtualization within this idea of the data fabric. And yeah, I think it's potentially very interesting, and that's an area we've been looking at as well. Obviously, data virtualization has been around for many years. There's different reasons why it hasn't perhaps been adopted as well as it could. But I think, yeah, in certain, if you're looking about, you've got data distributed across multiple environments, sometimes it might make sense to move some of that data. Sometimes it won't, depending on the use case. And yeah, data virtualization certainly has a role to play in this. It won't have a role to play in every use case, but yeah, it definitely does in some of those, yeah.
And we do see this, as a provider of global data management solutions. We do see, partners that are working with us that are data virtualization, specialists, right? They bring in that capability, and we see a pretty strong combination as a complementary solution to customers, where they see this as not overlapping, but more like a complementary solution to what we offer versus what the partner brings in terms of data virtualization. Any other questions? So now I just want to leave you with the thought that this notion of data fabric is not something analysts are making up. This is something, even as vendors, we are seeing it as competitors are talking about it, as other vendors, other partners in the space are talking about it. It might be called like different things. As Matt said, be careful of what that term actually means, what your other vendor is actually talking, and be sure of whether you're speaking the same language or not. But it could be different words or different meanings coined by different analysts or different vendors, but the fundamental premise is the same. Everybody wants this notion of a simpler way to tag your data and be able to look across the board and bring it all together, because that's a significant challenge that we are facing from here on until we sort this out, which might take a while until we get this act fine, right? So we are all in this together. So thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate it. And join us again on the next session. Thanks.
Thank you.